War. War never changes. But Fallout, as a franchise, has. In fact, it's changed a lot. From the old isometric CRPGs to that one PlayStation 2 title we don't talk about, to the new and overall very well received first person RPGs. But not all of the changes made to the series were positive, and this is especially true with Fallout 4, which, despite having the highest player count in the series, falls short of its predecessor in almost all aspects, being held up by its improved engine and more sandbox-esque world that allows you the freedom to just do whatever you want without worrying about an overarching plot. Unfortunately, there are numerous decisions in terms of narrative writing, overall design, and gameplay mechanics that hinder the game's quality as a role-playing game. Due to having a pre-made character with a fully fleshed out history, most in-game choices are out of character or outright inconceivable. If you play a female character, canonically known as Nora, you are a lawyer with no combat or survival training, which means you would never survive the first hour out of the vault, as you could never take on a gang of raiders by yourself with no support, armor, or weapons other than a laser musket and whatever weapons you found in the vault, i.e., a baton and 10 millimeter pistol. If you play a male character, canonically known as Nate, you are a veteran, specifically a heavy infantry trooper who wore power armor and used heavy energy weapons, as you can see here, making most other builds be out of character for him, especially builds devoted to talking to people and being friendly and not committing war crimes. That last part comes from a statement from one of the lead writers that indicated that Nate actually participated in the liberation of Canada, and he is shown in the intro to Fallout 1 as being witness to war crimes while laughing heartily as his friend gives let's call him a defeated enemy combatant a third breathing hole. This was taken back, but only after massive community backlash, so many still consider it to have been the original intention for the character, and therefore canonical. Funnily enough, this was also accepted by the overall community as the reason why Nate and Nora know each other, as it is likely they met during the process of Nate being tried for war crimes and eventually found innocent, possibly due to Nora's lawyering or due to the American government intervening to protect one of its soldiers. In regards to leveling, easily one of the most important aspects of any RPG, Fallout 4 drops the ball almost entirely, being the worst of the franchise by far. No more skills. All growth is done through perks, and those perks are incredibly simplistic and shallow. Most combat perks reduce to a single line of generic, all-round damage increases for melee, unarmed, pistols, rifles, and heavy weapons. No build separation between energy and ballistic weapons, despite these being incredibly different, with energy weapons requiring specialization in order to be properly maintained, fired, and reloaded. No skill lines to follow and develop as you grow stronger, leading to every build feeling incredibly shallow. Companions. One of the most important things in any single-player RPG is your companions, the people who follow you and accompany you throughout your journey. Unfortunately, in Fallout 4, most companions are incredibly lackluster at best and don't stand out at all from the others, feeling like they are only there to pad out the roster rather than to give a complete spread of options to the player. This is not just caused by the lack of properly defined skills in Fallout 4, as we mentioned before, but also by their lack of well-developed storylines. Some companions outright feel like quest-giving NPCs, such as Preston Garvey, more so than actual followers, and others don't even make sense as companions, either because they lack combat experience, such as Piper, or they simply would never want to join you in the first place for extended period of time, such as Strong. The base game of Fallout 4 has 13 permanent companions, most of whom don't have any noticeable skills or perks, with the exception of Kate, who can lockpick, Dance, who, thanks to wearing power armor by default, is incredibly tough, Dogmeat, who doesn't count as a companion for the purpose of the Lone Wanderer perk and can find items and grab enemies to make them vulnerable, McCready, who can steal items, and Nick Valentine, who can hack terminals. Not to mention, most companions don't even have a companion quest to function as the climax of their story. Only Kate, Curry, Dance, McCready, and Nick have them. That's 5 companions with quests out of 13, leaving the other companions to feel lackluster. The DLCs add new companions, but these are also not particularly unique outside of their significance as NPCs in their own DLCs and quests. Dialogue. The dialogue of Fallout, as seen in Fallout 1, 2, 3, New Vegas, and even to some extent the PlayStation 2 game that is not to be mentioned, is incredibly interesting and well developed. This is because it's mostly text based. And at the time, when you have a protagonist, you don't expect them to talk, you don't expect them to have a voice of their own, which allows the writers to create a spread of options that allow you to fully characterize your personality in the RPG. You can be a complete nutcase in Fallout 1 and 2. You can be that same nutcase in Fallout 3 and New Vegas. Unfortunately, due to the dialogue wheel being used to severely dumb down the dialogue compared to previous games, it is incredibly lacking in depth and, honestly, soul. Options are homogenized to such a degree that, honestly, every time you talk to somebody, your 4 choices consist of yes, make a joke, ask a question, and say no, which, honestly, most of the time kind of just means yes. The options shown in the dialogue wheel are also not that reflective of what is actually going to be said by your character, due to how the dialogue wheel only allows for a handful of words to explain your option, which ends up forcing you to kind of have to guess what your own character will say, and sometimes you even have to reload a save because you said something that you didn't want to say in the first place. And this next point is something that I cannot stress enough. I do not blame the voice actors for this. This is entirely on the backs of whoever was giving them directions. The voice actors for the main characters, Nate and Nora, don't seem to be aware of the scene they're in, which means that a lot of the times you'll be in a somber scene where everybody is sad and your character is very cheery, or you'll be in a scene where everybody is very trying to be very quiet and your character will speak at full volume, or worse yet, someone is angry and almost shouting at your character and your character responds in an almost friendly manner, completely negating any intention, pressure, or depth in the scene that you're in. Now, before we talked about your character's build, and in a lot of RPGs, the thing that completes your build is the weapons and armor that you're wearing. So let's talk about those. Regarding unique weapons and armor, something that in previous Fallout games, specifically Fallout 3 and New Vegas, you could expect to find a unique weapon for almost every single category or even every single weapon type. And while in Fallout 3, you could expect to only find a weapon that was essentially just the same as every other weapon of its type, but with a special name and a damage increase, in New Vegas, every single unique weapon had a reason for why it was unique. Some weapons were a higher caliber. Some others were simply more advanced versions of the same gun, such as the CZ57 Avenger compared to the minigun, or the Q35 Matter Modulator when compared to the plasma gun. Could also just be a highly customized example, such as the All-American or the Pew Pew compared to the Marksman's Rifle or the Laser Pistol, or, and this was also sometimes the case, simply an impossibly rare example of a weapon, such as that gun which is an iconic weapon brought all the way from Fallout 1, which essentially consists of a rifle that's been filed down and customized for use as a handgun. Or another very rare example of a weapon in Fallout, the Alien Blaster, a unique weapon that you can only find by encountering aliens, which are a thing in Fallout and are an incredibly interesting enemy to encounter because of how advanced they are. However, funnily enough, the nuclear bombs are suspected to have actually prevented their invasion by making the world inhospitable to them and actually buying humanity a few very important centuries to be able to defend themselves against it. And funnily enough, it ended up working, as we see in Mothership Zeta in Fallout 3 and later on in some other examples where you encounter them. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said for Fallout 4's quote-unquote unique weapons and armor, as most are simply named generic variants of weapons and armor you could get during random encounters, with notable exceptions being Grognak's axe, Krem's tooth, Lorenzo's artifact, both of which are kind of just unique mods rather than an actual unique weapon, the Deliverer, the Broadsider, the Cryolator, and the 2076 World Series baseball bat, which, if we're being honest, is really just a generic baseball bat that has a unique legendary modifier. Now, some more unique weapons can be found in the DLCs, namely the Tesla rifle, the Assaultron head, the Striker, and the Adam's Judgment. One of my personal favorite weapons in the game, even though personally I don't like the redesign to the Super Sledge. I'm a fan of the old design used by the Brotherhood of Steel. And in terms of armor and clothing, most outfits are quote-unquote unique in the sense that they were made specifically to be worn by a particular NPC, but grant no real outstanding benefits other than a handful of items that can truly be considered unique, namely the Grognak's costume, Minuteman General's outfit, the Silver Shroud costume, the Rescue Diver suit, which is from a DLC, and the Inquisitor's cowl, also from a DLC. This is a woefully small selection for such a large game, especially when you consider how the scope of the game was meant to be such a selling point for Fallout 4. And even after so many years and so much additional content being added, the game still lacks for the uniqueness that defines Fallout and that has defined it for all of its previous titles. And since we've been talking about how generic even the most unique items of Fallout 4 feel, let's talk about the weapon customization. The customization of weapons in Fallout 4 is done in such a way that it actually reduces weapon variety by having all of this variety, quote unquote, be done through different customizations of the same weapons. And unfortunately, the variety provided by this is so negligible that at the most you'll simply have automatic and semi-automatic variants of the same 3 or 4 weapons being used by everyone in the game world. And all this does is cut down on the weapon's identity rather than make them feel unique or personalized. You can no longer see somebody using a weapon and instinctively know how effective that weapon will be against you based on your own items and equipment. And additionally, the customization of melee weapons is done to such a degree that it throws all semblance of balance out the window, making the baseball bat somehow the strongest weapon in the game, thanks to it greatly outdamaging all other options for a fraction of the weight. For comparison, this is the damage that it can deal compared to the Super Sledge, which is supposed to be the peak of melee weapons in the Fallout setting. And yet, they deal the same damage in the base game when fully upgraded, and when you include the Nuka World DLC, which adds a number of additional customizations to the baseball bat, it severely outdamages the Super Sledge while only weighing a fourth of the weight. Beyond all of this, Fallout 4 has a woefully small number of different weapon types. For comparison, base Fallout 4 has a total of 2 ballistic pistols, 7 rifles, 2 shotguns, 3 types of pipe gun, 3 energy guns. Institute lasers and laser guns are essentially the same weapon with a slight recolor, and all energy guns can either be customized to be a rifle or a pistol with no real loss of effectiveness, and 6 heavy weapons, not counting the broadsider and cryolator, as those are uniques. In New Vegas, you had 8 ballistic pistols, 11 ballistic rifles, 4 submachine guns, 4 submachine guns, 6 shotguns, 1 heavy ballistic weapon, the minigun, my personal favorite, 7 energy pistols, 7 energy rifles, 5 heavy energy weapons, and 4 explosive weapons. Not to mention, there's a unique variant for most of these. Again, the only reason why this is a relevant comparison is because Fallout 4 had significantly higher budget, significantly higher development time, and significantly more time to prepare itself to have a higher scope than New Vegas. And it should have had that higher scope. Unfortunately, it doesn't. As for weapon design, most of the weapons that were redesigned for this game were, in my personal opinion and the opinion of many others, were visibly downgraded in appearance, with the worst offenders being the assault rifle, the Gauss rifle, the super sledge, and the Deathcall gauntlet. I won't go into great detail on this, as it's one of the most talked about topics regarding the game. I will simply say that the redesigns were not to my taste, or that of many other fans. Now, we've talked about the variety of weapons, and we've talked about the customization. I've even mentioned how that customization severely damaged the balance of the game. But let's talk about the balance of these weapons and how they fit into the expected growth of power and how they fit into the expected power scaling of an RPG. Previously, ballistic weapons were extremely common, from the 10mm pistol to the assault rifle to shotguns of any kind. Ballistic weapons are common, and their ammunition is common and easy to acquire. This means that they are very easy to maintain and use in combat. By comparison, energy weapons, laser, energy, and the much rarer and almost unique pulse weapons were far rarer and harder to maintain, but by comparison, they were far more powerful and much more effective. Unfortunately, in Fallout 4, ballistic and energy weapons are now complete equivalents, transforming the former peak of weaponry in Fallout into honestly generic weapons that are just as effective as the average service rifle. Additionally, thanks to some changes to the system, melee is now outright superior to unarmed in all aspects, making it so unarmed combat is an outright bad choice to specialize on, by entirely removing a previously extremely popular build from the game. Unarmed weapons are also not usable while in power armor, while melee weapons are. Not to mention that due to the potentially infinite scaling melee weapons receive from strength, they are essentially superior to any other weapon in the game, possibly outdamaging even the iconic Fat Man with every swing of your baseball bat. And since we've mentioned unarmed weapons in power armor, let's talk about the changes that were made to the power armor. The previously self-sustaining suits that would allow a soldier to be out in the wastes by themselves with no support for weeks at a time without even needing to stop to have a drink of water. are now inefficient energy dumps with fusion cores that would otherwise power an entire vault for hundreds of years, now only being able to power a single one of these suits for at the most 30 minutes. Additionally, power armor is now incredibly slow and clunky to wear, as opposed to previously where there was, as stated, no loss of mobility. And yes, this is stated to be the case even as early as Fallout 1, where the armor is stated to provide increased strength and protection, and, due to being relatively lightweight, great speed. Now, it is true that relatively lightweight does still mean it would weigh 80 pounds, approximately 36 kilos for a suit of T51 power armor. But this is still not to the degree of the almost several hundred kilo power armor that we see in Fallout 4 and later on in the Fallout show. The armor was also stated to provide no loss of mobility, especially when properly fitted and worn by an experienced operator. Secondly, power armor being the only item in the game that can be broken and that requires constant repairs in order to be at full effectiveness makes it feel brittle, and it's almost like you're wearing paper mache. Whereas in previous games, especially the originals, power armor made you feel damn near indestructible. If you've played Fallout 3 and New Vegas, you know what it feels like to wear power armor and be in a shootout with some mutants or some raiders, and every time one of them tries to hurt you, you can hear the pinging of bullets trying their best to damage your armor and failing. The same cannot be said in Fallout 4, as even a burst from the lowliest of combat rifles will result in your armor suffering significant damage and losing much of its effectiveness. Finally, and this is more of a nitpick in my opinion, but the fusion core being vulnerable to small arms fire is a glaring weakness that genuinely makes no sense. It makes enemies wearing power armor be less threatening than they should be, and anyone who thinks about it knows for a fact that this would never have made it onto production. There is no reason why the fusion core should be exposed in this way, especially when it is previously established that just by filling up the power armor's supply of fuel, the generator that is built into the armor would have sustained it for hundreds of years. With power armor out of the way, I want to talk about the scope of Fallout 4 one final time, specifically when it comes to monsters. In much the same way as with the weapons, rather than having more monster types to represent unique dangers in the Commonwealth and to show that we are in a new area with new monsters, new mutants, new enemies for us to encounter and defeat, there's actually a severely reduced number of monster types with a higher number of variants of the same monster that, frankly, don't behave any differently from each other. With even Fallout 2 having higher enemy variety, Fallout 4 has 12 total monster types with a lot of variants, I'll grant, but all of them behave the same. In Fallout 1, there are 11 monster types, and in Fallout 2, there's 13. Each one needs to be fought slightly differently, with them having different resistances, different weapons, and different behaviors. In Fallout 3, there's 15 enemy types, from raiders to super mutants to different enemies who need to be fought differently because they fight you differently. And in New Vegas, there's 23. And even the most iconic of enemies in New Vegas stand out because of how much more dangerous and much more difficult to deal with they are because of their unique ways of fighting and moving. Now, onto a topic that many consider to be a little controversial: namely the inconsistencies. This is something that to me is extremely important. I think that every time that you go back and you change something in established canon for a story, you muddy the waters of that story. You cheapen it for the future because it becomes very hard to feel invested in a story if that story is constantly changing what has been previously established. Which is why this is so important to me and why I think it should be more important to others, but I understand that it isn't. So let's get into it. The first one, and in my opinion, the most glaring, the T-51 is no longer the peak of armored infantry technology before the war, being replaced by the T60 model. Now, some people have brought to attention that the T60 was originally meant to be a side grade to the T45 model. Unfortunately, that is not what is in the game, and so it is irrelevant. The final decision that was made was that the T60, despite having no established lore behind it, no story, no history in the world, was to be the replacement for the T51, the most storied armor in the game and easily the fan favorite. Jet, previously established to have been invented by Myron, a 16-year-old sociopath in Fallout 2, is now a pre-war drug that can be found inside of vaults, which I understand how this may be something that goes under the radar, but it shouldn't have. Not to mention, this has been brought to the attention of the devs multiple times, and despite this, has never been corrected. There have been multiple patches to the game of Fallout 4, and in not one of them has there been something to remove the jet from the vaults and replace them with any number of pre-war drugs. Liberty Prime, the giant mecha that is shown near the end of Fallout 3, and who was initially developed to be deployed in Anchorage, but ended up being sidelined by the deployment of power armor, is now stated in game to have been present at Anchorage, even though it was a secret that the mech was even being developed in the first place. This is shown in the Robco headquarters building by the Automated Employee Training Program. This training program is given to all employees, including janitorial staff, which raises the question, is Robco leaking government secrets to all of its employees, even its lowliest staff, or did the devs simply disregard the lore that they themselves have established? Because keep in mind, Fallout 3 was written by Bethesda, which means this is something they wrote. There's no real excuse here. It makes no sense that they would miss something like this. And it makes even less sense that Robco would be leaking state secrets. So the only real option is that they, once again, are just disregarding what they previously wrote. The final one, and this is one that a lot of people might not understand because it is something that can be reinterpreted to almost be correct, but it is still incorrect. Previously, there was one singular example of Mark I Advanced Powered Combat Armor, aka the X01 Power Armor. This model was located in the White House, and it was recovered by the Enclave before the war and taken to the Enclave oil rig, where it was used to develop the new line of power armor used by the Enclave, and later the Mark II Advanced Power Armor, which is what we see in Fallout 3. In Fallout New Vegas, you can actually get your hands on a suit of Mark I Advanced Power Combat Armor, known as the Remnant's Power Armor. Many people consider this to be the best armor in the game. Personally, I'm partial to the T51, but that's besides the point. Previously, established lore states that the X01 power armor is a post-war creation used by the Enclave, and the Enclave had no presence in the Commonwealth. This is important because, despite this, you can find numerous suits of X01 power armor spread throughout the Commonwealth, even in military convoys, or found in military bunkers, or worse yet, found on random rooftops, unprotected and unguarded. Additionally, and this is a minor thing that speaks more to the changes in the power armor, but the X01 was initially meant to use different inner systems, stronger servos and stronger under armor, as well as new plating that would be far more protective than what is found in the T series, i.e. the T45, the T51, and the T60. However, now they use the same power armor frames as the T-series models, which would mean that there is nothing that makes it more advanced, nothing that makes it different than the other power armors. Now that we've talked about gameplay and we've talked about some inconsistencies with the story of Fallout 4 when compared to previous titles, let's talk about the world building of Fallout 4, isolated from anything that came prior or that came after. We will now be talking exclusively about the story of the game. Within the first hour of gameplay, you're given a suit of power armor, a minigun, and you fight a Deathclaw in single combat. This Deathclaw is easily dispatched as you have the peak of armor and the peak of weaponry, which means that immediately the game cheapens what is meant to be the greatest foe that you can encounter in the entire wasteland to a random encounter at the start of the game. After this, every fight and every reward feels lesser, especially since most quests end with a reward of a small amount of caps, experience, and honestly, very little else. Sometimes you get a weapon or a legendary item. Throughout the game, we're told that there's a number of factions that are trying to help the Commonwealth, chief amongst which being the Brotherhood and the Minutemen. And yet, there's barely any presence from either faction throughout the wasteland outside of the player's direct action. There's some outposts from the Minutemen and a few outposts from the Brotherhood, but they don't do much other than hold a single point that is in the middle of nowhere and so far away from any focuses of civilization that it kind of makes you wonder what they're even doing there. The T60 power armor, which is introduced for the first time in Fallout 4, essentially appears out of nowhere and doesn't have a place in the story. Let me explain what I mean by this. Previously, the T45 series of power armor, worn by the Capital Wasteland chapter of the Brotherhood of Steel, was developed by Westech between August 2065 and 2067 as a response to the Chinese invasion of Anchorage. This means that before the Chinese invasion of Anchorage, there was no power armor. Looking at you, Fallout Show. This short development time resulted in a number of design flaws that made it hard to move in and even had some final vulnerabilities in its armor, as showcased by the ghoul in the Fallout Show. Over the next 9 years, Westech worked tirelessly to create an example of power armor that had none of these flaws, and eventually the T51 was deployed in June 2076. It had none of the flaws of the previous model, was far more mobile, better armored with no outstanding vulnerabilities, and it was quite simply superior in every way. It was so strong that it pushed the Chinese invasion all the way back to their capital city, and in fact, almost took that capital city, if not for the bombs dropping. In the 16 months between the T-51 being deployed and the Great War happening, the T60 was developed, deployed, and fully replaced its predecessor as the premier symbol of the American military in Fallout, as shown in numerous propaganda posters throughout the world. It's stated in the wiki that it was developed in secret at the same time as the T-51 and rapidly deployed immediately after the conclusion of the Battle of Anchorage. This makes little sense, as it would mean that Westech wasted resources in the development of the T-51, which was previously stated to be the better armor and not stated anywhere to be more expensive to manufacture, only to then replace it with an untested model. The T60 Armor would be far better integrated in the lore of Fallout if it had been created by the Brotherhood of Steel using their own suits of T45 power armor with integrated technology from the advanced power armor worn by Enclave soldiers, which they would have recovered after the events of Fallout 3. Okay, with that out of the way, I promise not to talk about power armor anymore until... No, I don't. Maxim looks and acts like a grizzled veteran, even though he is referenced multiple times as appearing extremely young. Maxim is supposed to be 20 years old, and yet he looks like he's pushing 40s. It's a complete disconnection from what the player can see while playing the game and what every single NPC in the world tells you. The only reason that I know that Maxim is supposed to look like a kid who just finished college is because I go into the wiki to look for this type of information. Meanwhile, everyone I know who's only played the game thinks the guy's in his 30s, if not his 40s. And then there's the Institute, constantly claiming to want to distance itself from the Commonwealth because they see it as a lost cause to even attempt to help it, even though most of the problems that they point to in the Commonwealth are their own fault, problems that they themselves caused directly. From the super mutants and the synths that they constantly release into the Commonwealth and don't do anything to help the people in the Commonwealth survive these threats, to the general paranoia and lack of civilizational development caused by their constant kidnappings and assassinations. After that comes the quest design. And the quest design in Fallout 4 is, in my opinion, one of its biggest shortcomings. The vast majority of quests in Fallout 4 consist of entering a generic area, defeating a horde of almost entirely generic enemies in order to recover a single item, either from the leader of these enemies or from a crate that happens to be placed at the deepest part of the cave, while offering minimal development to the overall story of the world, or even advancing the narrative in any way. There's a few exceptions, but they are so few and far between that you could be excused for not knowing they exist. Compared to Skyrim, which did roughly the same thing, at least there you'd be sent to a random dungeon you hadn't visited in that playthrough, meaning that you usually end up exploring the map much more. Not to mention, each dungeon actually deepened your understanding of the world around you and was unique, with unique items to find and unique NPCs to encounter and puzzles that you couldn't find anywhere else in the game. This means that every quest in Fallout 4 feels more like a quote-unquote radiant quest, as Bethesda likes to call them, which is really just a fancy term for repeatable quests that don't add anything to the actual game, even though there are numerous sources of infinitely repeatable quests in Fallout 4. Looking at you, Preston. You fuck. This means that rather than using these Radiant quests to pad out the world in order to focus on more well-developed and interesting quests and dungeons with bigger and more overarching storylines, Bethesda chose instead to exclusively use Radiant and generic quests in their game. This speaks to the overall laziness that seems to permeate every single part of Fallout 4. The general feeling is that the design of the game is so uninteresting, with numerous mechanics expressly meant to pad out the content and keep you playing without ever taking the time to actually be interesting enough to be worthy of your attention, and doing nothing to advance the setting forward. The success of Fallout 4 led to the launch state of Fallout 76, and even today, the vast majority of 76's quest and story consist of very much the same padding and mindless time waste that Fallout 4 was known for. Although, I will admit, 76 has improved a lot from its launch state, and yet it's still a far cry from being anything that could resemble a good game. Starfield was exactly the same: lazy, overblown, and uninspired, with terrible weapon design and boring gameplay elements. This may be hard for you guys to believe, but I'm making this video to talk about everything that was done wrong in Fallout 4 because I don't want those same things to be done in Fallout 5 or whatever it is they're going to call it. I want Fallout 5 to be good and to be able to thoroughly enjoy it without feeling like I've been taken advantage of. But with all of Bethesda's recent contributions to the gaming space, I know that won't happen. Although it could if they actually look at this article that mentions that Sven from Larian, the guys who made Baldur's Gate 3, is actually very interested in making a Fallout game. I think their team would make an amazing isometric Fallout game, a return to the origins of Fallout. Hell, they could even make a remake of Fallout 1 and 2, and I think that they would shine so bright if they were to do that. Regardless, Fallout 4 is a bad game. It's always been a bad game. So is 76. Even though it's improved a lot since launch, it's still bad. And so is Starfield. It's shameful that a franchise with as much potential for personal stories and world development has been left in the state it's in by Bethesda's leadership and writing staff and game development staff. And it's tragic that so many people are so willfully blind to it. I hope you enjoyed the video, or that it at least made you think about how the game could have been so much better and how it should have been so much better. But if you didn't enjoy it, I hope that you at least can see where I'm coming from with what I said and what I think. If you want to support me, like the video and subscribe, and leave a comment talking about something you agree with or something you disagree with. Leave your own thoughts on the game. Leave your own thoughts on how Fallout 5 could be better. Leave your own thoughts about how Bethesda could improve the franchise, how they could go back to being the company that they were once lauded as. With all that being said, I'll see you all next time. Cheers.